Okay, so Dr. Wendy Roscoe has a PhD in physiology, and she focused on immune system functions and autoimmune diseases through her research. And she studied at Western University in London, Ontario. She's a professor of biology and physiology at Fanshawe College for the last 14 years. She's also the author of the textbook called Biology, Anatomy, and Physiology for Health Sciences, which is used in colleges and universities in Canada. And she's also a holistic nutritionist from the Canadian School of Natural Nutrition since 2015. And she also volunteers with the Canadian COVID Care Alliance. So with that, we will let Wendy give us a short presentation of some of the common narratives we hear, and then we'll open the floor to questions. And at 9 o'clock, we'll go poof.
Okay, great. So I will share my screen. Can everybody see my screen? Okay, perfect. Okay, so these were some of the thoughts that were in the list that Sarah gave me. So I'm going to touch on a few of these things. So common thoughts are that masks protect us from getting sick, or that even if it isn't perfect, it's better than nothing, or it helps elderly people or vulnerable people. So even if we're healthy, we should wear a mask to protect those people. I haven't been sick, so the mask is working. People in Asian countries wear them, so they must do something. A mask doesn't hurt anyone, so we may as well wear them. And there's studies that say that they work. Health Canada tells us that we should wear them. So there must be something to that. And masks must at least reduce the severity of infection. I threw that one in, Sarah, because I think it's an important point that I want to talk about at the end. So just a diagram to start with. I made this graphic because a lot of people don't really quite understand exactly how small a virus particle is. And so if we took a little tiny sample of the mask, we blew it up and magnified it, the pore sizes in between the fibers of a mask is between 80 and 500 micrometers. And this dot here, that's about the size of a period, is about the size of a coronavirus, which is 0.12 micrometers. So if the openings are 80 micrometers are the smallest, and a coronavirus is 0.1, that's literally like worse than trying to keep mosquitoes out of your yard with a chain link fence. And the other thing that we have to consider is that the mask isn't fitting properly. It's not ever fitting perfectly. So there's gaps around the edges, which are obviously way bigger. So there are lots of studies that have looked at the effectiveness of masks. And I have a reference sheet that I will share with you. I'll put a link to a Word document that I have in a Google Drive. But many studies have shown that masks are either not effective at all, or that they can actually cause some harm. So these are all scientific research papers that are published in journals. So masks provide no effective protection against coronaviruses. There's randomized controlled trials that show that there's no effect on preventing influenza from spreading. Even looking at N95 masks that are much tighter fitting, and they keep out 95% of airborne things, but most airborne things like dust and dirt and debris that's in the air is much larger than virus particles. No association between mask mandates and a reduction in COVID spread. And then they looked at masks in schools, and masks were not effective in preventing transmission. And then a couple other ones. This one I wanted to point out because it's a Cochrane review, and they look at reviewing all kinds of research done in the same topic. And then they even concluded that looking at lots of different research studies, masks were not effective at preventing the spread of infections. And this study is really good. It shows 150 comparative studies that show basically that masks are not effective at preventing infection. So one of the things that people think is kids are going to bring home infections and it's going to make their grandparents sick. And so that's why they should need to wear a mask. And I want to point out that COVID isn't the only virus that's out there. There are about 200 different respiratory infections. I'll just use a little pen here, different respiratory viruses that are always in the atmosphere, that are always evolving into different variants. Like we have the influenza, we have adenoviruses and rhinoviruses and coronaviruses, there's respiratory syncytial virus, there's all kinds of things that we're always exposed to. And they're all around the same size. Most virus particles that infect humans are all as small as coronaviruses, are very similar. So seniors and vulnerable people, they're exposed to all kinds of things unless they're living in an isolated environment. The other thing that I wanted to point out is that only 300 virus particles are required to make someone sick. And when you have a sick person that has COVID, they are releasing about 750,000 virus particles per minute when they're talking. So now think about going to Walmart, where people have been shopping and talking and breathing, hundreds and hundreds of people in a day. What's the probability that even if the mask did happen to block a few virus particles that were caught in droplets, the probability that someone is not going to be exposed to at least 300 particles is pretty much zero. So you're going to have exposure. The other thing that I wanted to point out is droplets versus airborne. So a lot of people assume that virus particles are only found in droplets, like if you cough and you have mucus or saliva, those droplets are much bigger and the mask will stop droplets. But virus particles are airborne, which means that they aren't just in droplets. They can just freely be exhaled with your breath and they can go through those masks. When we look at different countries, so Asian countries wear masks commonly, and they have for a really long time. Excuse me. When we look at the early distribution of COVID, the Asian countries where people normally wear masks, they still had COVID. So it wasn't preventing the transmission of infection early on. When we look at different countries and when they started to mandate masks, so Austria, for example, they mandated masks here. It was already on the decline, and then they still had another wave, right? Because viruses evolve and they mutate, and so they can kind of come and go in waves, and lots of different viruses will do this. So Belgium, they implemented masks and they still had a surge here. So in every situation, wherever masks were mandated, there was still other waves still happened. And there's lots of reasons for that. There's lots of factors that impact how much a virus is going to be transmitted and how severe the infection will be in people that do get sick. The other thing is that with Asia, there's lots of reasons why they wear a mask, and it's not just to prevent infections. It's very socially acceptable to wear it in a somewhat kind of accessory kind of a way. If they didn't want to put makeup on that day, they put on a mask, or if they want to hide from paparazzi, right? It's a socially acceptable thing for people to wear masks there. So lots of times they wear them for just, kind of hiding themselves reasons or for pollution reasons. So there's an entirely different culture around masks in Asia. Another common thought is that, well, the governments are mandating masks, and there's lots of studies that show that they work. And for some reason, there's a lot of research that seems to be not as, what's the word I'm looking for? Not as
robust.
Yes, thank you. That's the word I'm looking for. Not as robust as it used to be. And so for some reason, studies are either not peer reviewed or they're getting through the peer reviewed process, and they're just not And this is possibly true for the studies that show that they don't work either. But we can't trust every single thing that we see in a research paper. Even before COVID, there's a lot of things that can make research not cut and dried, not 100%. And this is why it is actually really important to have scientific debate. We need to have scientists that say, wait a minute, you didn't look at this factor. And then they do another research study, and then they come up with different results. And then that is the whole process of science, is to debate these things. And so when we have certain research that is censored, or doctors are not allowed to talk about things, then that has a lot of ramifications for what we end up seeing and what we end up believing. But there's one study, as an example, the Bangladesh study is one that is used frequently to say that masks work. But the crucial data was not included in that research study, which is unfortunate because it completely affects the conclusion of that research. And then over here, this diagram, this is one of their results. So the control versus the treatment, does it look like there's any difference in the control group versus the group that wore the mask? Right. So the other thing that happens in research is there is some bias that can happen. You know, a group of scientists have a hypothesis and they want to prove their hypothesis, but their results don't always show what they want it to show. And so a lot of people we're all busy, and I do this too. I will look at a research paper and I'll read the abstract. That's that little summary at the beginning of a research paper. And it tells you, this is what we were looking for. This was our methods. And this is the conclusion. This is what we found. And then unless you go through the whole paper and look at the research and look at the methods and their statistical analysis and what the actual results showed, you can't always know that the conclusion they came up with is the correct conclusion. So we do have to be a little bit careful when we're looking at research. And then the other topic is, well, if masks are harmless, then why not just wear them anyways? But are they really harmless? There's a research review. They looked at 178 different research publications, and this is one of the best review papers. Not going to go into all of the details, but there are consequences to wearing masks that affect pathology, that affect neurological, so how your brain functions. When you have increased carbon dioxide, decreased oxygen, it can affect cognitive abilities. It makes kids tired, less able to focus and concentrate. There's psychological factors that are affected when kids can't read facial expressions or body language. Like there's a disconnect there. There's immunological factors. So I'll talk about that part a little bit more in a second. Dermatological, so that's your skin. So affecting the pH and having that constant moisture on the skin can cause different kinds of microorganisms, bacteria to grow and cause acne. There's dental issues, there's sociological, pediatric effects. So there's all kinds of things that can actually be caused by wearing the mask. Another one that came out recently is looking at the microplastics in those disposable masks. A lot of those blue surgical masks are made of different types of plastics like polystyrene and polycarbonate, polyethylene, and those little micro fragments can be toxic and they can have effects, especially if people are wearing them every single day for many hours for the last 2 years. Then there can be effects of that. And with cloth masks, recent study shows that it can actually increase the risk of infection because bacteria can grow inside the mask. And there was this other study that showed 11 different pathogens that were growing inside of children's masks. So when they're wearing these masks for 7 hours a day, all of these different kinds of things can be growing in there, and it can make you sicker if you're going to be breathing these things. It actually can also increase COVID because, your immune system is going to be dealing with a lot of these different things that are growing in there. Now, another thing that I wanted to touch on is what affects the severity of infection. So there's a lot of factors that affect. So one of the comments at the very beginning on my first list, it said, I've been wearing a mask for 2 years and I haven't gotten sick. And so you can't just automatically assume that it's because you are wearing a mask. There's many, many factors that affect how sick people get from different pathogens, and if they get sick at all. So these are some of the main things that affect the severity of illness from all of the 200 different kinds of things that we're exposed to all the time. So sleep is super important. Your body sees it as a stress if you don't get enough sleep, and stress has a huge impact on your immune function. Cortisol is a hormone that inhibits the immune system. Nutrient deficiencies, things like zinc and vitamin D, if you don't have enough of those nutrients, your immune system doesn't work. Previous exposure, when we are exposed to viruses that are similar as they evolve and mutate, they have some similarities. Our immune system makes memory cells that recognizes things that are similar. And so you're less likely to get sick from things you've been exposed to previously, right? That's natural immunity. And yes, natural immunity, just like vaccine immunity, will wane over time as viruses evolve and mutate and change. Then you could have mild symptoms again, but you will have memory cells to things that you've been exposed to before. Our microflora has a huge impact on how our immune system is regulated, how it functions. Exercise affects growth hormone production, which affects the immune system. Obesity was a major risk factor for COVID. And age, I threw in this little graph. You can see that the majority of people, and this is typical of all respiratory infections, typically highly affect the very young and the very old. And then lastly is comorbidity. So the people that have the highest risk of COVID infection have diabetes or heart disease, along with other things, but those are the most prevalent things. So then I wanted to just show you this diagram and ask for your opinion about this. Who do you think will have healthier immune system? Someone who is indoors and perfectly clean and using hand sanitizer and killing pathogens, or kids that are playing outside in the dirt being exposed to soil bacteria and microorganisms in the atmosphere? I'm curious now, I do have that 2-minute video that I'll show you that I did with the sanding drywall, which I think is just fun. Do you want me to show that first and then come back to this?
Sure. Go ahead.
Okay. So you can see, like, so it's just, that was just a funny visual, because if you, let me stop sharing. If you think about the size of a virus particle and the cloth mask or the blue mask that people typically wear, and how much space is around them, and then how big the particles are and how big the virus particles are, you can't see virus particles, and you can see drywall dust. So if drywall dust is getting in there and it's like 1,000 times larger than virus particles, then probably virus particles are getting in. And again, if you only need a few hundred to cause infection, even if it did stop, 1 million virus particles, if you're in a Walmart or a Costco or something with hundreds of people, like, it's just the number of particles that you're going to be exposed to. you're not going to be able to block it out. So the factors that are going to matter more are the ones that I talked about before: your health and your stress and your cortisol and your immune function and your previous exposure, and all of those things play a much more significant role in the probability of getting sick than a mask.
Perfect. So we have 7 more minutes. I feel the science is settled on the mask, and I haven't worn it at all in the last 2 years. And people just wonder how I operated, how I'm still alive. But here I'm talking from planet Earth. But if there are people who want to ask questions, we do have time right now. So go ahead.
I am curious though, who's healthier, the A or the B? The kids with the inside with the hand sanitizer, or the kids playing outside? What do you think? Do you think when you're outside, you're more exposed to things and you're more likely to get sick? Or like, what do you think?
Well, I'm so tempted to answer that.
Yeah, I know you know, but I want to know what other people think.
What do others think?
May I ask something, Sarah?
Sure, go ahead. Yes.
You talked about children wearing masks, and then I think you said that because they wear it for 7 hours, the virus begins to multiply within the mask itself. Is that what I understood?
I don't know if viruses can't replicate unless they're inside of a human cell. So viruses wouldn't replicate in a mask, but bacteria can. So when you're breathing into a cloth mask and there's moisture, bacteria, because we have microflora, there's all kinds of streptococcus and all kinds of things that are in us. And when we breathe those into the mask, then the bacteria can grow, or fungal organisms can grow as well. But
so what sorry. Yes. So what I want to know is that within how many hours they do multiply, because that would be very harmful for the kid. But what I'm asking is that supposing the mask were to be changed often, would that help at all?
It can definitely help. And I think that, medical professionals that wear masks, the sort of golden rule is to take a break from the mask after 4 hours, have a 1 hour break, and then wear it again. Obviously, surgeons in surgery, can't always do that, but healthcare professionals should take a break from the mask every 4 hours. With kids, the other thing that also happens though is, they have dirty hands, and then they touch it and they play with it and they move it and wipe their face. And so, they're going to have a lot more exposure to all kinds of things that way, which actually isn't even technically a bad thing in small ways, because it helps your immune system be resistant to things. But as far as things like the different kinds of organisms that can grow in there, changing it more frequently is definitely better than keeping it on all day long. Is somebody else asking, or then I can ask later?
We'll just let Steve speak, and Steve is a professor at UBC, so I'm sure he has something he can add to this. Go ahead, Steve.
Well, the E. coli, which is one of the bacteria that you would find in masks, it can multiply every 20 minutes. So it doubles every 20 minutes. So if you've been using a mask repeatedly, you can expect it to be pretty much full of bacteria like E. coli. And I think an infectious disease expert, like, for example, Dr. Brett Finley at the University of British Columbia, who's well known, he always has a book that says, "Let them eat the dirt." So I think that's the answer to the original question of who is going to have a better immune system, is actually the kids that are sitting in the sand and the dirt.
Well, that is true to a very great extent, because in India, at least, children are always thrown on the floor and the ground and the earth. So they do have immune systems maybe much stronger. But also the fact is that the child mortality is also very high there. So I don't know how, of course, I have no data from the studies. But so the thing is that with this particular COVID, there's one thing I wanted to ask you, that how much immunity does the COVID cause? That if I get, somebody gets infected with COVID, they are getting it again for the second time. So does that mean that the body system is not supporting, I mean, the immunity of the body is not increasing? Because generally with typhoid, you know, if you get typhoid once, then for a whole year, you don't get it. But with this COVID,
that it depends on how many different virus particle or different virus organisms or they're not technically living, but species of viruses. There's all kinds of different respiratory infections. So if someone gets sick with COVID-like symptoms, and then say 6 weeks later they get something else, it doesn't necessarily mean that it was COVID again. It could either be a variation of it, right? Because there's been many, many different variations of COVID, or it could have been a rhinovirus or an influenza, or, you know, there's lots of different organisms that can cause the same kind of symptoms. So
that's right.
So it's very difficult to say whether the immunity works. Yes, go ahead, sir. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say that we've been studying the generation of antibodies in people in response to SARS-CoV-2 virus, and we can detect in our study participants antibodies even 2 years after they've been infected, which are actually quite high, probably because the SARS-CoV-2 viruses remained in the environment and were constantly exposed to it again, and it acts as a natural boosters. But there has been studies with SARS-CoV-1 and also with MERS, which are related to SARS-CoV-2. And even 3 years later, they can still detect antibodies in people. But the memory B cells that produce these antibodies, ultimately, they're with you probably for decades. And it may take a little time for them to ramp up and get reactivated and produce antibodies. And during that period of time, it's kind of a race in how fast the virus can replicate versus how fast your immune system can ramp up again for that specific virus. And you may get sick in between, depending upon all these other factors that Wendy has actually highlighted, that all add to the equation and whether or not you're going to get sick again when you're re-exposed.
And different viruses have different rates of evolving or changing or mutating. So something like chickenpox doesn't mutate nearly as fast as something like common cold viruses. So if you had chickenpox when you were a kid, you're not likely to get it again because it doesn't change very much.
Yeah, that is the thing. So this virus, the COVID virus, is definitely far more different, in which case the vaccines that we are getting shall not work for every virus type that there is in COVID.
Actually, they do work. Most of the antibodies that you produce in response to a SARS-CoV-2 infection are actually work well on mutated strains, because the mutation is limited to, in the case of the Omicron, only 3% of the overall structure of the virus compared to Wuhan. And the parts that you make antibodies against are actually different from the parts where the mutations occur. So it's a fallacy to think that actually you don't have immune protection if you've already been either vaccinated or actually previously exposed to the virus, because firstly, the Omicron, people get over it much faster, which means you can only get over it if your immune system recognizes it. And people get protection from the vaccine, at least initially. And so that means that their immune system is able to recognize Omicron, even though they're being injected with a vaccine that's based on the original Wuhan strain. And then, as I pointed out, you're making antibodies against many different parts of the spike protein and the virus. And so you actually have most of your protection there. I think that the difficulty is that the Omicron can actually be more infectious. And so it can be faster, that you can likely to accumulate exposure to it. And so again, it's a race between your immune system and the virus, that you can produce enough antibodies or T cells to take out the virus before it starts causing a lot of symptoms. And most people, especially children that are infected with SARS-CoV-2, they don't actually have any symptoms. It's now been estimated that as much as 80 to 90% of children already have antibodies against SARS-CoV-2, and most of them never even knew that they were infected.
Yeah, they have a stronger innate immune system, which is the immune cells that work at the beginning of an infection, whereas the adaptive immune cells, like the memory cells that I was talking about earlier, they tend to take a few days to sort of, increase in population to be able to fight things. So as we get older, we sort of decrease our innate function and increase our dependence on memory cells.
So famous last words from me were, we'll go poof at 9. And as we know, this is such a hot topic, and we're kind of veering into the vaccine, which I wanted to limit this to the mask so that we settle the science on masks. But that's great. That means we do have a lot of interest. So I will let Sonia ask a question, unless Wendy and Dr. Pellick, you have to run somewhere. Is that okay if we let?
It's okay for Sonia to ask, yeah.
Okay, so we let Sonia ask, and then please do come next Monday at 8:30 p.m. again, and we will have another Monday Night Science Alive, and we'll settle the science on some more questions, and we'll peel off the onion slowly and slowly, and we will have a resource library so we are equipped. So Sonia, go ahead.
Okay, hi, Wendy. I have a question regarding the way that masks were kind of, advertised. It's not clear whether some people believe that they're protecting themselves, and other people say, oh, you're protecting others. What was the science behind it? Is it that you're protecting yourself? Is it that you're protecting others? One thing, then that's my one question. Another one is, where did they come up with the fact that, for example, in restaurants or whatever, where you are wearing a mask to go to the washroom, but then as soon as you sit down, you take it off, and then it's kind of okay.
Yeah.
And I was just trying to, particularly with the school where my children go to, they decided to follow the Ontario Science Stable advice, and were kind of extra cautious with adding the 2 weeks of mask wearing. And I was trying to argue with them and bring the all these studies to no avail. They were really, really scared and concerned, and were convinced that masks were protecting the children and the teachers, and were absolutely not aware of any studies showing harms of the masks. So it seems like that masks are very effective at maybe subduing the fear,
Yeah.
but not so much at
There's some
protecting.
research that talks about that, where, because people believe that it's doing something, that it helps to decrease the fear. But whether you're breathing the virus particles out of you through the mask, like the mosquitoes are going from your yard to the neighbors through the chain link fence, or the other way around, I mean, the fact remains that there's big gaps around the mask, and virus particles are extremely small, and they're not just in droplets. So virus particles are going in and out of people. And they're being shared and transmitted. And like the graphs that I showed you were in different countries where they implemented the mask mandates, it had no impact on transmission at the population level. So I think that it seems to be about fear and psychological aspects. And I did put some references in the chat in a Google link. That's a Word document, and there's some in there that talk about the harms. Maybe you can bring that to their attention and see what they say.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I was just I was on a plane, and the flight attendant was asking me to take the mask and, like, while I'm eating, put it on in between the bites. and
Yeah.
take it off.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. Like if you're
Like,
standing, then you have to wear a mask. But if you're sitting, you
sitting,
don't. Is like
yeah.
I thought of a meme that I was going to make, but I never ended up having time. But take the tables from restaurants where you're allowed to eat without a mask and put those in schools and classrooms, because they're
Exactly.
magic tables. You don't need a mask to sit at those ones.
Well, I think you don't need to be a scientist to understand that this has nothing to do. It's so ridiculous. This has nothing to do really with science or facts. So I'm wondering if even arguing the studies would deal with the actual issue that we're having with these masks.
Yeah, it seems like arguments involving looking at science and data have not been effective.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
But thank you.
yeah, thanks so much. So I will close this with the quote from my dentist when I asked him, why is your office open if I have to still wear a mask? Because when I come and sit on your chair, you take it off. And not only that, you put a really high pressure jet in my mouth and it plays all over. And then 5 minutes later, you get somebody else. And he said, it has nothing to do with stopping the spread of the virus. It's just to keep people from being fearful. And he says, just make sure you have it somewhere on your face, because we will be called by the public health and we might get closed down. So as long as you have it somewhere on your face, we are fine. That's my dentist.
It's too bad that we can't make people feel less fear by telling them how their immune system works and how to get enough sleep and reduce stress and live a healthy lifestyle and eat micronutrients and plant foods, and they can actively do things that help their immune system, but they've never talked about those things.
I think they initially, the problem happened was when people assumed that it is only going through the water droplets but they did not understand that it's in the air and it's airborne. So thank you so much, Dr. Pellick. Thank you so much, Dr. Roscoe. Really appreciate you coming out here, and everybody else. Thank you so much. And we'll see you again next Monday night, Science Alive, next Monday. Off you go.
Thanks.